Good morning, respected dignitaries, Sajida Madam, all the office bearers of the VMFT Trust, and my dear friends. I have been given a topic which is perhaps a little challenging, mainly because there are different perspectives to the word language. So I'm a little anxious about speaking on language because there is everybody's perspective to language. So what I have, maybe a medical professional's perspective to language. We can have a school teacher's perspective to language. You can have a mother. My mother is here. Her perspective to language. And when you speak on this, at the end of it, you might always end up not covering or looking from the other person's perspective. So that's the tough challenge. And language has many facets, and my talk will be mainly on the neurobiology or a medical professional's perspective on language. Let us see how I can maybe also associate it with a school teacher and a layman's perspective of language. So usually we are used to clicking the screen right in front of you. So this is the first time I'm doing it remotely using artificial intelligence. Okay, so language and the human brain, the concept of language is ever evolving. It's in a state of flux. And maybe 50 years from now, a talk which I'm giving today would be completely outdated and totally out of perspective. So let me begin by paying tribute to the great reformer in whose memory we have this foundation set up, who was a man of letters, who was a linguist himself, and who perhaps laid the social reform thinking of language in our minds that has inspired this talk today. Vakkom Mohammad Abdul Qadir Moulavi, who lived in the era from 1873 to 1932, a language reformer and undoubtedly a man of letters, and who has created a social reform not just in the state of Kerala, but the seeds of it have gone all over the world today. So the word language, we often associate language with speech. We also associate language with words. But as very rightly put by the linguistic reformer, Noam Chomsky, language is not just words. It is a culture. It is a tradition. It is a unification of a community. It's a whole history that creates what community is. And all that together is the concept of language. So some of you may feel that language actually divides people, divides the world in the form of regional languages rather than unites people, but that is not so. As I go further on in my talk, I will probably prove the point that language actually, despite its diversities, actually unifies people. So let me start with telling you some very, very startling facts. So we know that there are more than 200 countries in the world today, and there are more than 7,000 languages worldwide. But the interesting fact is that more than half of the 7 billion plus people in this world today can speak more than one language. So they are bilingual. And very, very surprising to know that the country which has the largest languages is a very, very small island called Papua New Guinea, located in the Pacific Ocean, where there are as many as 840 languages. And India is not very far behind. We are fourth place with 453 languages. The language we are most familiar with, English, is the one that has given the maximum number of words to humankind. And the bard of Avon, whom we all know, Shakespeare, is the reformer who has contributed the maximum number of words to the English language, as many as 1,700 words almost 200 years ago, in the little over 50 years that he lived on this earth. So this slide, is maybe if I were giving this talk in Beijing or Shanghai, people might not really agree with this slide, but these are the statistics provided by Statista, which is an acclaimed statistical organization, which says that the most commonly spoken language on planet Earth, spoken by as many as 1,456 million people, is English. Okay. Now, Mandarin used to be, or Chinese used to be, the commonest language, but most Chinese, or most those who are adept with Mandarin, can also speak English. That's how English has slightly stayed a little ahead in this race. And our Indian languages, Hindi, Bengali, are not really too far behind. And it will be very interesting to note that even Malayalam ranks 29th in the list of world languages. Imagine standing 29th in a race where 7,000 languages are competing. So that's something definitely credible. And 38 million speakers that Malayalam has today in the world. So we all probably are familiar with this historical note on the Tower of Babel. So this is where the concept of languages came about. So in the religious texts, the Bible and the Quran, there is a mention of a tower. And this is before the time when languages actually came about. Once upon a time, in time immemorial, there was a time when everybody in the world understood each other and spoke the same language. And when that happened, instead of being a united force, they decided to take on the forces of the heavens, and they decided to build a whole tower which went up to the heavens. And when this came up, the creator decided that, we need to create languages so that people wouldn't understand each other. And this is how the mythological story about the Tower of Babel came up. And even in the Holy Quran, there is a mention of a similar tower which was built at the time of Moses. And this was a tower again which was almost similar to the Tower of Babel. And there is mention about language and its impact on humankind in almost all scriptures. The Holy Quran mentions that and of his signs is the creation of heavens and the earth and the diversity of your languages and your colors. Indeed, that are signs of your knowledge. In other words, the more languages we have, the more perspective we have about humankind, the more perspective that we have about the world. So that is the concept that is conveyed here. And the Bible also says that no matter how many different languages that you have in the world, not one of them is without meaning. So I have just structured my talk with these subheadings. First, the concept of language, which I have already introduced to you. The neuroscience, that is what areas in our fascinating human brain are actually involved in the generation of language, and how language develops over a period of time as we evolve in our understanding and knowledge of the concept of language. How do you assess, are there some scales for measuring language? And from a medical professional's perspective, there's always the concept of what happens when language goes wrong. How do you set it right, and how do you actually measure how much of it is wrong? That is dysfunctional language. And today we are in the era of texting, chat GPT. So the whole concept of language in the artificial intelligence era has completely changed. So the first question always that comes up is that language, whose domain is it? Everybody may say that language is my area, but whose domain it is actually? So the mothers may say that mother tongue, I introduced my child to the language, so it's my domain. The teacher will say that, I taught my students the first lesson, so it's my domain. The linguist or the literators say that, I have written books that have expanded the volume of language knowledge in this world, so it's my domain. The literators may say that, I am a content creator on YouTube and I have put in more words. And you have, every year the Encyclopedia Britannica, the Webster's Dictionary, everybody has been coining new lexicons, new words. So language keeps ever expanding. So there is an etymologist, that is somebody who looks into the origin and the structure of words, their perspective of language. There is, a speech therapist who will help you to get your speech right in the event of a disease like a stroke, which has, affected language. So they could also claim to be language experts. You could have, a medical professional like a neurologist who treats, maybe some form of a neurological dysfunction affecting language. They could say that this is my area. And most importantly, the layman, the common man says that, I speak the day-to-day language, I understand the pulse of the nation, and language is my area. So, you can never have a last word. What we need to understand is that everybody's perspective of language is very different, and we need to absorb each other's perspective. And this is not anybody's turf war. Everybody's perspective has a point, and we need to understand that point. So each perspective has a value. So this is the basic definition, the principal method of human communication. which includes words in a structured manner. You may probably argue that animals and birds don't have any language. It's just because we do not understand. If you see, there is a pattern in the cooing and the cawing of the birds. There is a pattern in the barking of a dog. So perhaps there is a language which we really don't understand. So language is not just talking or speech. It has got gestures. It has got non-verbal communication. It has got writing. So many aspects to it. And the American Psychology Association has actually defined it as a system for expressing or communicating thoughts and feelings through speech, sounds, or written symbols. So there are a lot of aspects to it. Suppose you utter a word, how are you? So, you could have so many meanings to it when you intonate your voice. So that's why language perhaps goes beyond the 4 words of how are you. You could say it, how are you? Or you could say, how are you? It's so much of intonation and phonation which conveys a whole new different meaning to language. So if you see some of these words, if you go into the history or the etymology or the origin of these words, you would realize that the word brother is how we put it in English, bruder is German, brata is Sanskrit, and Persian calls it biradar. So in other words, perhaps all of them have a common origin. And the common word that we use to say this is lingua franca or everyday parlance. So when you are living in a town, say like the city of Trivandrum, there is a Trivandrum dialect of Malayalam, there is a 𝐒𝐚𝐽𝐽 dialect of Malayalam. So the lingua franca is the everyday language that you use in your everyday communication, and everything has got a meaning and origin. So the language development theories, perhaps I'm not an expert to talk on this. Maybe the teachers and the psychologists know much more about this. Just to give you a small idea, actually there are the basic 2 theories, which the Skinner's theory, which means that, this is a reinforcement theory. In other words, you already have some sort of a background knowledge, and the more you expand your background knowledge, the better you get at understanding things and developing your language. While Chomsky believes that there is a nativism in language. In other words, children who are born already have an ingrained language which they have maybe wired into their genes, which develops a little further. So these are the 2 broad aspects of language. So there is, when I am speaking to you, there is an area in my brain which is working very, very hard. That is called the Broca's area, which is the motor speech area. And at the same time, when you are asking me a question, there is another area in my brain called the vernix area, which is the area which is involved in understanding of the speech, and that is the vernix area. So one of the basic units of speech is known as morpheme, and the basic unit of the sound of speech is called phoneme. Perhaps you are already familiar with this terminology. So if we use a word called kind, so there is one, kind itself is one morpheme. And if you say unkindness, so there are 3 morphemes in that: un, kind, and ness, each of which have some standalone understanding or meaning. At the same time, the pronunciation, the basic concept is phoneme. So this is again a field by itself. My idea here was to just introduce you to this concept. So when a child grows up, there are some inbuilt language skills that the child has, which are developed further and further on as the child grows up. So maybe perhaps at the age of 6 months, beyond the meaningless crying age, is when the child turns to a voice. And by about 9 months, he is able to say, maybe bisyllables like mama or dada. And by around 12 months, this goes further on to one-step commands. And then, by 1.5 years, pointing to body parts, saying about 3 words. And then this grows up further and further. The vocabulary keeps getting acquired and becoming stronger and stronger till about, 3 years of age and 4 years, when the child's speech becomes more understandable and is able to communicate in a little more comprehensible manner. So there is a little bit of variation sometimes in this, but these are the normal milestones for language development. And that language development never ceases, and there's a lifelong learning. So every day we learn new words, every day we understand the old words in a better perspective. So what used to mean something to us, say, if we say artificial intelligence, so maybe 20 years back that word would not have meant anything to us. But today it has got a new meaning, and maybe 10 years from now the meaning would be completely different. So there are basically 4 aspects of language. Phonology, which is the sound of a language. the syntax, which is the grammar of a language, which is putting words in the right context and sequence. Semantics, which is giving it sort of a meaning. So, if I say, are you, how, it doesn't make any meanings. But if I say, how are you, in a particular syntax and a particular semantic, it has a meaning. And most importantly, pragmatics. So, if you go to a function where, people are mourning, and you say something which is completely out of context, that is not pragmatic. So, language has got completely many aspects, the four main aspects ending with pragmatics. And this is, putting it in a more pictorial form. You have the form of language, you have the content of language, and ending with using it in the right way at the right time. That is the pragmatics of language. So I think we are all looking forward to a wonderful lecture by Dr. Sajida on bilingualism. And Dr. Sajida, I think, has done phenomenal work with the VMFT. And I was seeing some of the old photographs in 1992. I don't see any dampening of the enthusiasm and energy in Dr. Sajida. And I will leave this to an expert that is speaking about multilingualism or bilingualism. But just a general perspective on it would be that it, in simple words, means the ability to speak different languages. So some of you may ask, that in the era of Google Translator, is it really an advantage to speak many languages? Are you really, won't you, dilute your understanding or knowledge of your primary language if you try to learn another language? Okay, so all these are acceptable arguments, and you could always have a whole day discussing these points. But what we need to understand is that it's always gives you a competitive edge, in this world of cutthroat competition if you are adept with an additional language. And there are several factors which influence you to pick up another language. Sometimes it is out of necessity when you move into a new city. Sometimes it is to go with the crowd or go with the flow. And sometimes it may be just to appear very fashionable and trendy. And in the Google Translator era, I think the phenomenon of multilingualism is slowly dying out. So every language has got an origin or an etymology for each of these words. So some of these Malayalam words which we are very, very familiar with, they have their sources outside the language of Malayalam in more ancient languages. For example, the word Umma is actually from Arabic. The word baptism, Mamodisa, is a word which is used usually in the Christian texts and has got an origin in Syriac. Similarly, the word quorum, minion, which actually comes from Hebrew. And then there are simple words like pataka, which is a boat, which again has got a origin in the Polynesian languages. And then if you see almost every word, there is an etymological origin in that, which makes it really very fascinating when you go into the depth of it. And most importantly, some of you may have tried your hand at trying to learn the Oriental languages, Chinese, Japanese, and you would have really struggled, So the concept of kanji is central to Japanese language, wherein every letter has got a lot of depth in its meaning. So in the English alphabet, maybe A is just a structure. But here, every alphabet is not just a structure. It actually conveys a lot of meaning. So if you actually look at this, if you look at the word for rice field, so there's a letter which actually conveys, if you just write it this way, the message is conveyed. So if you have a letter which is written this way, it actually conveys that it is a rice field. So this is the concept of the word kanji, and both Chinese and Japanese languages have evolved over a period of time, and even there are newer scripts and newer dialects, but the central core remains trying to convey the meaning of the word in the form of the alphabet, which is not attempted by most of the other languages. So Malayalam language, again, our script has evolved over a period of time, and the current Malayalam language, perhaps the modern lingua franca that we speak today, has its origin somewhere in the 15th century. And the father of modern Malayalam, as we know, is the great social reformer 𝐒𝐚𝐬𝐡𝐢𝐵. And there are about 15 dialects of the language today, and it is still growing in the new era. And language is often considered to be equal to communication, but there are other aspects of language which we need to see beyond the words that we speak. That is non-verbal communication. No, there is so many aspects of language that we need to delve deeper into. And there are the five main, the domains of language. The phonology, that is the rules of speech sounds. The morphology, that is the structure of the word, and we already discussed about morphemes. Syntax, that is the rules of a sentence. Semantics, which is the rules related to, using language. So speaking the right thing probably at the right time. And most importantly, pragmatics, how you use your, you may be a very, very skilled, extempore speaker, but if you speak the wrong things at the wrong time, your speech or your language really doesn't stand out. So this is again the same thing in a little more of a pictorial format. So there is form, there is content, and using it the right way. In conversations, in routine storytelling, in taking lectures for students, all these put together makes up the beautiful concept of language. So again, this is these concentric circles that you see is tells you how language evolves. So we actually start initially with phonetics, then we have phonology, that is giving some shape to the sounds. Then you have morphology, giving further more shapes and words to the sounds, and then you have got phrases and sentences. Then you have got little more meaning in the form of giving shape to those phrases and sentences. And finally, you reach the stage of pragmatics, wherein you are, involved in some form of a discussion, debate, and discourses on language. So let me tell you a very, very interesting story. Perhaps some of you may be familiar with this gentleman if you have seen his photograph before. He is a very landmark figure in the history of understanding the human brain. So his name is Phineas Gage. And he lived in the late 17th century and early 18th century in the United States. So he was a railroad worker. And if you look at his face, it doesn't look normal. You would have seen that one of his eyes is closed and he is holding a long, something like a long bar in his hand over here. So this bar and his closed eye is what actually historically symbolizes what happened to him. So this man was an ideal human being in society. He was very kind. He used to take care of his parents, his family. He was very polite. He was the ideal, well-mannered individual till one day in the history of time when he was working on a railroad construction job, that there was a blast injury. And in that blast injury, this rod actually pierced through his jaw. And it looks something like this. Okay. So this is how it looks in a schematic diagram, okay? So perhaps when you see this, you would never associate it with some form of a meaningful existence. So you would never imagine that somebody who had an injury like this would have continued to have a meaningful life. But he survived this accident, and with the crude little bit of medical care that was available in that era in the late 17th century, he still survived. And when he survived, he gave medical science a very, very important lesson on the functions of the brain. Because what happened was, if you see, this, where this rod is coming out, it is coming out, going through his face and coming out through the vault of through the skull. So it had damaged the frontal lobe or the anterior part of the brain. And after this accident, not just that he survived, he became a completely transformed personality. He became very violent. He started using abusive and profane language, and he was a completely altered personality, though he continued to live a meaningful existence. So that is when the neuroscience researchers of that era, he is considered to be a classic case of understanding the function of the brain. Only when we don't have something, we realize the value of what we have. So when his frontal lobe of the brain was irreversibly damaged, only then people realized what are the functions of the frontal lobe of the brain. And only then, over a period of time, when actually some form of healing in the brain happened and his function recovered, did people realize, how the brain is capable for some form of recovery, if not complete recovery. So this is a very, very landmark case, and there's a museum, in fact, devoted to him, where even the rod has been kept. There's a cast of his face and so many things. It's a very, very interesting story from the understanding of language and personality disorders. So there are some areas in the brain which probably we are already familiar with. So this is just a schematic diagram of the human brain. So this whole thing what we see here is the frontal lobe of the brain. So we have 4 lobes. We have the parietal lobe here where we have the occipital lobe, and here we have the temporal lobe. So the speech is mainly regulated by an area called the Broca's area, named after this gentleman whose name is Pierre-Paul Broca. He was a French neuroanatomist, and this area of the brain is which actually produces the speech. So when you think on what you're going to speak, the impulses on that are actually generated from here, and this goes to the areas of the peripheral mechanism, that is your voice box, your larynx, where you can actually generate the speech output. And this is an area which is called the sensory speech area, and this is called the vernix area. And the vernix area is which understands or comprehends what is being told to you. So if you ask me a question, it actually goes to my vernix area, I process it, and then the Broca's area helps me to tell an answer to that question. So the language function is for right-handed individuals, it is in 96 to 99% modulated on the left side of the brain. And in left-handed people also, in 60% of individuals, it is on the left side of the brain. So this is the same thing about in a little more pictorial manner. So the language areas of the brain, the vernix area, the vernix area here, the vernix area here, the Broca's area here, and this is an area which is called the motor cortex, which is involved in your movement of the body. So even the movement of the mouth or the speech apparatus to actually generate sound is generated by the motor area. So this is terminology perhaps which some of you who are working in the area of speech will be very much familiar with. So this is actually a MRI. So some of you probably might have seen some relatives undergoing an MRI. Some of you would have undergone it yourself. So this is a little higher MRI which is actually used for evaluation of speech function. It is known as a functional MRI. Now if you take a close look at it, so from a layman's perspective, what you can see here, perhaps you would have guessed by now that it is the brain. You can see the brain here, the grey matter, the white matter, and here you can see some area which probably looks a little different. So that is an area which is a tumorous area. That's a tumor in the brain. So what do you think are these yellow areas? Okay, so the yellow areas are actually the areas where there is more blood flow when you are actually doing a function. So when you are speaking, these are the areas which have got more blood flow. So you can see that this probably is a right-handed individual. So that's why there is more. This is the left side of the brain, and there is more blood flow to these areas. So this is the speech area. When you ask the individual to tap his fingers, again, there are some areas which are lit up, which is the speech or the finger tapping area. And again, when he is listening to a speech, these are the areas which are lit up by increased blood flow that can be picked up by, there are a lot of MRI sequences which help you to identify where the blood is flowing faster to the brain. So this is an indirect way of assessing the speech centers in the brain, which is commonly used in clinical practice. And the act of speaking itself is a very fascinating act, and as I said, it begins in the brain when you actually think of what you're going to say, and that is programmed by your previous learning, your vocabulary, so many other things. So you can't really simplify it in the form of a schematic diagram like this because there is so much of background to it. But then to put it in simple words, it initially, when you start speaking, this is where the signal is generated, and then it goes down through the spinal cord to the lower spinal cord, and from the spinal cord in the neck it goes to the speech apparatus. So actually the work of speaking is actually very closely related to the work of breathing. So your both lungs generate a breath which goes through the voice box, and then when it goes through the voice box or the larynx, there is a vibration of the larynx which actually is delivered out through the peripheral speech apparatus, which is the mouth, the tongue, the lips, and the mouth, the tongues and the lips give shape to the sound, and that is known as phonation. So this is the whole process of generating a speech output, and then finally there is a vibration or a disturbance created in the environment around you, which is the acoustic level of the act of speaking. And a quick word about the concept of cerebral dominance. So most right-handed individuals, they have, most of the people in this world, 95 to 99% are right-handed. Only 1% perhaps are left-handed. And left-handed you have, most of them have got a writes significant percentage of right-handed, about 85 to 90% have got a left-sided dominance, while 50 to 60 of left also have a dominance. So you have this, the common concept of right brain versus left brain. So this is the, left brain is what is involved in your analysis, logic, and for a right-handed individual, the left side of the brain is definitely more important in the generation of language. So you have analysis, logic, ideas, facts, max, training, so many things in the left side, while most of your creative skills are on the non-dominant hemisphere or the right side for the right-handed individuals. So creativity, arts, feeling about something, all these comes from the right side of the brain. And in current understanding of language, we really cannot stop with just speaking about words and phonemes and morphemes. No, you have to go beyond words. So there is something called non-verbal language also, where language is beyond speech. So you have got haptics, which is touch. So you meet an individual, he shakes hands with you. The intensity of the handshake conveys a lot about what he or she wishes to convey to you. You have gestures, which might be sometimes not picked up. You have proxemics, which is the distance that the person maintains from you. You have paralinguistics, which are again some other sounds, yawning or some sort of disinterest. You have facial expressions, body language, eye contact, a very important form of assessing non-verbal language. And then there are a lot of other things, artifacts, which may be something like fidgeting around with something, which might not really be a positive sign of a positive communication in body language. So I'll quickly show you a video of this is an individual who actually is undergoing a brain surgery. Okay, so while he is undergoing brain surgery, do we have the sound? Yeah, if you can just pause the video, I'll just put you in perspective. So this is something which is very unique, which is a development of the modern era of medical science, wherein when most of the brain surgery is usually done under complete general anesthesia, when a patient is completely asleep. But there are situations wherein we need to assess the language or the movement of the limbs and assess function during surgery. So this is a situation wherein the patient is actually awake during surgery, and I will show you how active he is while the surgeon is operating upon him on his brain. So this MRI here is actually a large tumor which is on the left side of the brain involving his speech area. To take it out safely, we need to assess the speech during surgery, so that if there is any dysfunction of speech, we can go back and we can stop it at that time, so that the speech is preserved to the maximum extent. So can we have the video please with the sound? So you'll be amazed to see how active the young man is during a surgical procedure. On the other side, this is the curtain here. Can we increase the sound please? So we are constantly trying to assess his identification of objects, simple words, repetition, calculation skills.
കർഷകൻ ഞാറ് നടുന്നു ഒന്നുകൂടെ കർഷകൻ ഞാറ് നടന്നു ഭാരതത്തിന്റെ ആദ്യത്തെ പടയാളി തിരുവനന്തപുരം മെഡിക്കൽ കോളേജ് എന്റെ കാളവണ്ടിയിൽ ഗോതമ്പിന്റെ 5 ചാക്കുകെട്ട് എടുത്തു വെക്കൂ.
So it is fascinating to see that while somebody is doing a surgery on your brain, you are able to actually perform functions with the brain without too much of a problem. And the good thing was that we were able to preserve the speech function in this individual, and he did extremely well later on. So the message here is that language is something which we definitely cannot take lightly, and we have to make all attempts to preserve it, even when it is likely to be damaged by disease. So a quick word about some form of disorders of language. So when I have shown you about the language centers in the brain, any disease which could affect these language centers could affect the language function. The commonest usually what we see in day-to-day life is a stroke, wherein the blood supply to that part of the brain is cut off and you have got some form of a speech difficulty. You might have brain tumors, you might have some developmental disorders since childhood which have affected the speech function. And the commonest situation, we find as teachers is you have a child in your class who is slightly laid back in speaking as compared to the others. So when you have that situation, what do? You want to ask the parents to seek help, but at the same time you're anxious if the parents might actually reprimand you for being slightly overactive in the field or assessing the child wrongly. So the question is that, is this actually a real problem or is it a language developmental delay? Some children, they have their own time when their language catches up. So is this really an autism spectrum disorder, which is a situation where you have got a language significant developmental anomaly versus a delayed language? So these are some of the the basic ways in which you actually try to assess them. So most children with autism spectrum disorders, they have limited eye contact, while the language disorder children, delayed language may have appropriate eye contact, and many a times the autism spectrum disorder children, they imitate, they do not really imitate actions and expressions, while the other group, delayed language, can actually imitate actions and sounds. So these are some of the broad ways of looking at, especially when you're a teacher, how you could intervene early and help to provide help from more experienced professionals who are working in the field of speech therapy. Okay, so testing language, I think it will become a little too heavy here if I say that, but what we need to understand is that we need to look beyond the spoken language. So there are some aspects, there are some standard tests, even very basic tests can be used by teachers in school. You do not have to refer to a complicated neuropsychologist or probably a hospital to do that, because usually children and their parents do not accept, when there is a problem, and they do not want to be given a false alarm wherein you create a lot of panic and then they go to their hospital and then they come back with a normal report. You did it with good intent, but then sometimes when the report is normal, they might not appreciate your intent. So basic tests on spoken speech, on written speech, listening, comprehension, which are all easily available, can be done to identify all the aspects of speech. And the amazing concept of the brain which is evolving now is the concept of brain plasticity. So you have heard this term called rewiring of the brain. When you learn a new skill, your brain undergoes some transformation. So, the basic cell in the brain is the neuron, and the neurons are connected to each other by what is known as synapses. And when you are learning a new skill, there are new neurons, there are new synapses that are developed, and most importantly, there are more neurotransmitters. So when you have done an action which is you have done before, you're familiar with it, your brain is already wired to do that. So same thing happens, and that concept is the concept of brain plasticity, which comes into force when you're learning a new language, which also comes into force when after stroke, you're trying to rehabilitate an individual and teaching him something new. You're doing a language, rehabilitation therapy. And most importantly, it is the young brains, that is the brains of children, who are more adaptable to this concept of brain plasticity. So if you, I'm sure all of you will agree with me that if you try to teach a young child a new language or a new musical instrument, they will pick it up much faster than all of us, because their brains have got more plasticity. While the more elder brains take a little time to adapt and create more of these, but then not to give up. Even the elder brains can have a lot of significant plasticity. And the new kids on the block, now there are some new languages which are coming up, the language of texting, the language of emoticons, the language of Google translators. So some of you would have visited China and Japan without even knowing the local language. You just need to dictate out into the Google translator, and the translator will type out the whole thing in the Chinese or the local language. You show it to your taxi driver and he again dictates it into another Google translator, and without knowing the language, just based on non-verbal communication and Google translator, you can negotiate the whole place. So this is the new language. And we have homes now which are completely artificial intelligence enabled, where you just need to tell something, Alexa, find out the best restaurant in town, and Alexa tells you where it is. Okay, so this is the new language. And this is often grandmothers complain that though my granddaughter and me, ഞങ്ങൾ രണ്ടുപേരും മലയാളമാണ് സംസാരിക്കുന്നത്, but we really don't understand each other. That is because the new generation speaks in this language, the language of texting. So perhaps these words might be Greek and Latin to many of the elder generation here, but for them who are from the younger generation, the little small girl who is sitting here, I think probably this is what she uses in her day-to-day communication. So LOL, laugh out aloud, oh my God, ASAP, and these words, there's no end to it. But I think we really cannot ignore this when we are talking about language today. And then there is this language which has got minimum words. And when I send my daughter a long text message of 2 paras, I usually get a response which has got just one symbol. So that's how the world is going. And the better we are at understanding these, the more perhaps we can gel with the new generation. So let me end with a very very important points to ponder. I can't call it a conclusion. I'll just leave you with these thoughts, which you can develop further. So I'm sure all of you will agree that language is not speech, or it is not written, or it is not something which we can very clearly put it up in simple words. It is a means of expressing ourselves, and it is continuously evolving and continues to be in a state of flux. Perhaps even now, over the last 15 minutes that we had this conversation, perhaps the Webster's dictionary has already coined some new words which are evolving in the world of language. And not to forget that language extends beyond what we speak or we communicate in the form of non-verbal language as well. And we need to understand the new lingua franca, that is the language of artificial intelligence, Alexa and Siri, and also get familiar with texting and emoticons. And let me thank you very much for this opportunity. And whenever you are faced with a tough challenge of learning a new language, I think these words are often very inspiring. So these words are, it is impossible, said pride. It's risky, said experience. It's pointless, said reason. Give it a try, whispered the heart. Thank you very much. And I'm very grateful to the Vakkom Moulavi Foundation and especially Dr. Sajida for this opportunity.